A rare treasure has come into my possession recently. Of all the art that has influenced my life, from great filmmakers like Stanley Kubrick to powerful, independent manga artists like Inio Asano, I don't think any of them will compare to the masterpiece of manuscript I have within this folder. The handwritten label reads only "Picture Books," but inside is a work that I have found transcendent of any medium. It is an extensive, experimental work in both visual form and storytelling structure made by a reclusive genius. The title, bearing to us the full weight of artistic grandeur within, is simply The Masters of Fighting. I may only speak briefly of my acquisition of these works since, as I said, the creator is a very private person. He requested that I not reveal his name here, so I will refer to him by a name of my choosing, which I believe accurately reflects his stature as an artist. The Creator. By his orders, I must not reveal any information pertaining to how I acquired these works. Suffice to say that it is an extremely limited edition, self-edited manuscript, never presented to any major publisher, and generally only shared by a few very close family members, friends, and other associates, whose ranks I am elated to have recently joined. I maintained correspondence with the creator as I read his work, and he has permitted me to publish a number of our conversations as they pertain to clarifying and explaining some of the inspiration which went into his creative process. After considerable persuasion from me, I have convinced him to allow this documentary series to be produced. Because he is such a secretive artist, with no other widely available work, he has had a long-standing ambivalence toward publication in general, believing very much in creation for the sake of the creative process, not for fame or profit. So what I will be showing you here is not only an artistic analysis of the work, but a complete recreation of its every page. To maintain the integrity of the original work, I will not be removing the staples which bind together many of these original pages. The risk of damage is too great. For this reason, scanning the pages will not be possible. I will provide the best photographs I am able, and will supplement them with digital replications or enhancements if necessary. The format of the story is quite unlike any that I have encountered in my life. The folder's descriptor of picture books is not wholly accurate. Typically, when one thinks of a picture book, they would picture a book for young children with at most a few sentences of narration and dialogue per page, and illustrations filling the majority of the space. What we have in The Masters of Fighting is more akin to a graphic novel, or perhaps like manga, since it bears the distinction of being a single artist's work. However, there are two more distinctions which set The Masters of Fighting apart from nearly all of its contemporaries. For one, dialogue is very sparsely used, and sound effect text even more scarce. Look at a popular manga like One Piece, and at times the dialogue practically overshadows the illustrations. Secondly, this manuscript bears only a single illustration per page, foregoing the panel structure favored by most other popular artists. It's always a joy to read manga and reach a page where the artist filled the entire space with a single illustration, but this is most often done for emphasis in a particularly dramatic moment. What the creator has done with The Masters of Fighting is use this approach throughout his work, really making the most of every single sheet of paper herein. The story progresses across numerous volumes, each consisting of about 10 to 20 pages apiece, not unlike the serial publication style of popular manga, though those may sometimes reach as many as 40 pages per chapter, depending on the publisher. However, the creator has insisted to me that he was utterly unaware of Japan's publication practices at the time, as he made his work in the United States starting no earlier than 1994, and probably spanning no later than 1997, but the exact dates have become obscured over time, due to having no dates printed on them. In this video, I will be sharing with you Volume 1, or as the creator labeled it, Part 1, and even this labeling has a story behind it. I didn't actually call it Part 1 originally, of course. When I first made it, it was just a standalone story. It wasn't until I made Part 2 that I went back and added the Part 1 text to the top of the first page. That's when I knew this had the makings of a grand-scale adventure series. On page 1, the very first image, the humble spark that would ignite an epic, world-spanning journey, we see the lone figure of a man being shot in the face by a big green laser. You might not know from this simple beginning, but this would set a tone for the rest of the series to follow. Notice how the man's left foot is ever so slightly raised off the ground, a possibly accidental detail demonstrating his body recoiling from this laser blast. I don't remember if I intentionally drew him like that. It was probably a lucky accident. It might just as easily have been the other foot and made it look like he was leaning into the laser. The man depicted here would have no name until later in the series, But for those of you uninitiated, this character is known as Roy, the main character and the very first master of fighting. On page 1, although his expression is blank, we see him fighting this laser. The positioning of this device on the floor beneath him is indicative of the story's broader themes of humanity triumphing over any conflict they may face, and rising above whatever seeks to tear them down. However, this theme will be given an ironic twist when we move on to page 2. Before that, however, I'd like to point out a couple more details. The great genius in the creator's decision to depict his characters as stick figures lends a great deal of ambiguity to this illustration. So little is known about Roy's identity at this point. He could be a man of any country, of any race, of practically any appearance. He is a blank slate onto which the reader may project a great deal of identity. Furthermore, his lack of an illustrated face means that my earlier statement about his raised foot indicating that the laser is blasting him backward may be incorrect. Just one example of how even I have projected my own interpretation onto his circumstances. It could be that he was facing away from the laser and was shot from behind, catching him by surprise. Or perhaps, in fact, entirely unaware of any laser shooting him at all. The pages that follow, and Roy's behavior therein, may add credence to this theory. It's worth mentioning here that Part 1 of The Masters of Fighting was one of the very few volumes to have more than one copy produced. The creator explains this.
Sometimes I would leave the book I'd made over at a friend's house and forget to take it home with me, or accidentally leave it at school or something, not knowing if I would ever get the original back, and in fact sometimes intending a copy to be a gift for a friend. I would make a new one just so I'd have the complete story in my own personal collection. But as it turns out, sooner or later, all of the original copies did eventually find their way back into my possession. Maybe my friends didn't like my gifts so much.
Clearly, they knew not what genius they once held in their very hands. I bring up this fact of multiple copies, which I will explore more fully at the end of this analysis, only to state that certain discrepancies in their illustrations may have colored my interpretation of the original Part 1. The last matter I must bring up in the discussion of the first page is the text at the bottom. It reads, and I quote, "A man is getting shunk."
It was supposed to say shrunk, but I forgot the R.
This text narrating the scene is a bit of a black mark on the series' history, as the creator explains.
I didn't originally have the text at the bottom at all. I guess this is the equivalent of some big movie director being pressured by the producers and the studio to make his work more accessible to the average audience. Basically, after showing the first couple volumes to my parents, one of them made the suggestion to me, why not write a description at the bottom of each page so it's easier to tell what's going on? They obviously didn't understand my work, and it's frankly a little insulting that they didn't think my illustrations were strong enough to stand on their own. I think these first 2 volumes suffer because of the added text. I mean, you ever see Dark City? That was a good movie, but in the theatrical release, the opening scene had some studio-mandated narration that ruins a big twist later in the movie, and lays the whole plot out far too obviously. The director's cut obviously removed that narration, but sadly I can never have my director's cut of parts 1 and 2 back. You just have to ignore the text, I guess.
Truly a tragedy for this artist's prestigious legacy. Let's just move on to page 2. As the creator said, the laser striking Roy on the first page was a shrink ray, as we now see his minuscule form standing next to a now enormous set of doors. It can be assumed from here that he slipped under the crack in the door, or perhaps slipped out as somebody else opened the door. The fact of the doorknobs being on the wrong side of each door indicates a sense of surrealism that will underscore a great deal of this series at large. And, though the narrative text might overall be a detriment to the series, here it indicates an elegant simplicity to the events so far. First we are told a man is getting shrunk, and now we are simply being told he decides to go on an adventure. This pure-hearted spirit of adventure will permeate all of the rest of the series. Here we see the underlying problem of this narration, in that it repeatedly breaks the fundamental rule of writing, show, don't tell, but we have already established the creator's distaste for its presence. Now, readers, no more will we ever see this mysterious facility in which Roy encountered this shrink ray. The creator has some comments on this mystery.
I had made 1 or 2 written stories after part 1 of Masters of Fighting which explored a similar premise, even featuring a character named Roy, perhaps the very same one. None of these works have survived, but they generally fleshed out more details of the beginning, stating that Roy was essentially a guinea pig in an advanced science experiment, but still no indication of who the scientists were or how he got roped into it, or even why nobody tried to pursue him after testing the shrink ray. The point of the story was to show a tiny person's adventures through a normal-sized world, not to dwell on how he first got there. The room with the shrink ray exists mostly as a framing device to show you how, practically, a miniature person exists in our normal-sized world. How he got in and out is better left to the imagination. Maybe he built the shrink ray himself, maybe he was an unwitting guinea pig, or maybe it was a mere accident that nobody noticed. In the grand scope of Part 1, it's not so important.
Page 3 is when the artistic talents of the creator truly begin to shine. The narration explains that Roy is going mushroom jumping, which, although it is not a term in most people's vernacular, is instantly understandable by its straightforward terminology. The surrealism only briefly indicated in the second page is now in full force, as the artist's full color palette is put into use to illustrate these bizarre mushrooms. Mushrooms we tend to see in our normal lives would mostly be a dull white or brown color, but the illustration here is practically otherworldly. On this page, it's hard to say whether Roy is mid-jump across this field of mushrooms, or if he is intently standing atop the center one like a triumphant conqueror. In what would normally be the fourth page, all we see next is a mysterious blot of color. I initially theorized that this must be some sort of symbolic illustration, perhaps a reflection of Roy's now overstimulated consciousness attempting to rationalize the world which has shockingly changed around him, represented as this tiny splotch reflecting his tiny size. However, when speaking with the creator, he cleared things up for me.
This work was actually the first time I had used colored pencils, and I think I made the mark on that page before illustrating the mushroom scene. I wanted to know what would happen if I used every single colored pencil in my box across the same space on the page. I had previously tried similar experiments with crayons and markers, and always had the same result, just a brownish, blackish smudge. I thought with this new medium that something amazing might happen, like I would illustrate some beautiful rainbow, or that the colors would combine into a brand new color that the world had never seen, and I'd be able to employ that in my work. Imagine the wave of inspiration felt by the first artist to combine blue and yellow and come out with green. But this turned out just the same as my crayon and marker experiments, so I took a more reserved approach to the mushrooms, only giving them 2 colors apiece.
Roy's adventure continues further, as he now encounters a normal-sized person. It is a fairly straightforward scene belying a lot of secrets which only the creator will be able to reveal. This page indicates the experimental nature of the artwork early in the series, as a technique is employed which will not be seen again in the rest of the story. Although Roy, up to this point, has not been drawn with any particular clothing, it is implied that he is dressed. Here, though, this other person is drawn wearing a green turtleneck, purple pants, and a black top hat.
The clothes on this character exist for 2 reasons. One was just to stretch an artistic muscle I hadn't used yet. My mother was actually the one who gave me the idea to illustrate clothes in this way. But the other reason was to differentiate this new person from Roy. I thought it might confuse readers, that it would be too hard to tell the 2 of them apart.
The lines above Roy's head indicate his surprise and fear at this bewildering sight, and this artistic flair will be used many times throughout the series.
That's something I probably borrowed from Marvel Comics, particularly Spider-Man's spider sense. I never actually read comics very much, but I was aware of a lot of them due to some trading cards my older brother had.
Even the bird drawn in the sky, with its simplistic M shape, has more to it than meets the eye.
It's kinda like Chekhov's gun, you know. That bird was originally drawn with a purpose. In my original plan, that bird was set up so that it would swoop down, pick up Roy, and carry him around through the sky. But when the time came on the next page, I realized I didn't know how to draw a bird up close, so I just played it off as part of the scenery.
Now, although we have established the main problem with the narrative text, here it actually lets us in on a layer of depth in the story that we might not have normally seen. It reads, he sees a giant, intended of course to read, then he sees a giant. This indicates a deterioration in Roy's self-awareness, a possible side effect of the shrink ray. It could be that he has lost his perspective and thinks that the world around him has changed rather than himself, or it may merely suggest that he was unaware that the shrink ray ever shot him. Here, the person has safely stepped over Roy without ever becoming aware of him. Roy expresses relief with a phew, The first dialogue written in the series. The presence of a crossed-out version of this person is one indicator that this page went through some troubles with development, as the creator will tell us.
I think I made a mistake initially when drawing the top hat. And here's where you see something that would become a recurring issue in the series. If I had made this mistake on a new page, I could have just thrown it away and started over. But you see, I'd already spent all that time drawing the previous illustration on the other side of the page. That other page was perfect. I couldn't redraw both of them from scratch, so I just scribbled away and made do with what I had. Also, I don't know if the pictures show this well enough, but even without the bird subplot, I wanted there to be an element of danger here that the normal-sized person might accidentally step on Roy. I hope it came across as thrilling as it was in my imagination.
There may be some debate among fans as to whether "phew" counts as the first line of dialogue in the series, as it may have been an instance of onomatopoeia, a sound effect rather than an actual word. But on page 6 there is no dispute. Roy now utters the phrase, "a castle," upon seeing a house. The mix of both uppercase and lowercase letters in this statement may be a metaphor for Roy's conflicted state of being both a tiny man and, in his own mind, still a normal human being. This page features what is so far the most resplendent landscape illustration yet. Flowers, shrubs, and trees all surround this house which, the creator has told me, initially caused some confusion. Because Roy appears to be the same size as the door on the house, some readers believed Roy had encountered a tiny house among these plants. However, the size of the trees and other plants in comparison to the house should make it plain to any observant viewer that this is merely a trick of perspective, and Roy is much closer to the front of the scene than all of the background landscape. On page 7, Roy's adventure within this house begins. It is unclear who the owner of this house might be. It may be a stranger to Roy, it may be a friend of his, or it might be his own house, with his change of perspective making it unrecognizable to him. Just past a coffee table with a stack of books or magazines and a ceiling fan above, Roy begins the arduous task of climbing the stairs. The scene indicates what I believe to be the essence of Part 1's themes, that a change in perspective reveals so much more wonder in the ordinary world around us than we normally see in our everyday lives. We might walk up the stairs every day of our lives but never think about how very different this simple act would be if we were, say, only a few inches tall. On the landing at the top of the stairs, we see a banister and the doorways to 3 rooms. According to the creator, this fictional house is based on the one he lived in as a child.
I drew this many rooms to give the house a more complete feel. Like it could really be a house somebody lives in, and not just a backdrop for my own story. I had originally considered having him explore each room one by one, but I thought it would be better to just get on with it and tell the story more briefly.
On page 9, Roy has entered one of the rooms. We see a bed nearby of such size that Roy would never possibly be able to scale it. Here, he has managed to climb onto the lower part of a small table, on which a television shows 2 figures. Barely visible here is Roy's utterance of "wow" as he explores this space. He takes up so little space on the page, and his dialogue is so barely visible, that it really highlights how minuscule and insignificant Roy is in comparison to his environment. This is likely a larger statement on the insignificance of mankind in the universe in general. Roy's statement of "wow" likely reflects that not only is he coming to grips with his tiny, unnoticed place in this gargantuan world, but the fact that the entire human race is similarly unnoticed in an incomprehensibly vast reality. Then comes Roy's descent back down the stairs. He asks, "Where's the king?" to nobody in particular. The disjointed spelling in his dialogue likely represents his unraveling mental state as the enormity of his situation only now begins to settle in. Still, he clings to his delusion that this must be a castle. Notice further the return of the surrealistic art style. A normal home might have roughly 10 steps between the first and second floor, but this home sports 28, an exaggeration most likely placed to show us Roy's distorted view of his own desperate plight. On the penultimate page, we see an outdoor scene overcast by an oppressive black sky. Night has fallen on Roy's journey, and he has taken refuge from whatever unnameable horrors might lurk in the dark by choosing to sleep in a tree. His act of climbing this sheer trunk must have taken the full remainder of his remaining daylight hours, and Roy's careful planning got him there just in time to find sanctuary. Finally, we come to the end of the story. The night has ended, and Roy stands next to the tree which provided his night's rest. We see now that it was a relatively small tree, only somewhat taller than Roy in his restored form. His brief reflection on this terrible ordeal, now safely behind him, is simply, "Glad I'm me." In the end of all things, despite whatever tribulations we might face, however our perspective and lot in life might change, and however our identities become distorted in the face of an overwhelmingly oppressive world, what remains of ourselves is ourselves. This is only one of many interpretations of Roy's final statement in Part 1. He might also be declaring, "If not for my own resourcefulness and indomitable will, I might not have survived the ordeals placed before me in this previous day. A lesser man than I could not have triumphed so. To spoil some things which are not to come to pass, Roy's ordeal with the Shrink-Ray and all associated parties, if any, are now permanently behind him. This trial has passed him by, and he chooses never to seek answers or restitution for the path that brought him here. All that matters is simply that it happened, and it is over. Life goes on. Let us seek only to build from here." The back cover boldly states "the end," but it would be far from so. While it is the end of one adventure, it is only the beginning of an expansive story which, frankly, has the potential to be one of the world's most prominent media franchises, if only it could be given the credit and exposure it deserves. Ordinarily, this would be where we part ways, and I encourage you just as emphatically as the creator did back in those days, to be prepared for the next volume. But Part 1 is a special case, as I also have in my possession 2 alternate copies of the book. These are not considered to be the true Part 1, even though they came later and might be seen as revisions, but this has been covered earlier in the video. The first alternate version was illustrated on a different type of paper. While the original was illustrated mainly on ruled notebook paper, this one appears on blank white paper intended for a 5-ring binder. The first page shows Roy in a much more stoic position than the original, a much less dynamic pose. The door on page 2 is now filled in with brown coloring and features an accompanying red exit sign drawn with block lettering. The mushroom scene is nearly the same, but with thicker strokes making for less discernible designs. There is no mistake page in this copy, but the scene with the top hat person is recreated almost exactly, right down to the coloring of the clothing and the distant bird which would go unused. The landscape outside the house is considerably less detailed, and the perspective is even more exaggerated, as Roy appears even taller than the doorway. Next is the scene of Roy climbing the stairs, which again is even less detailed than before, showing none of the living room furniture, but curiously, showing the contents of the upstairs rooms. Various mistakes were made in the illustration of the stairs and Roy's climbing motion. This and many other details indicate that this version of the book was much more rushed than the original creation. The scene of Roy entering the upstairs room is especially sparse, and the illustration of the room itself is so crowded that Roy can barely be seen. The doorway was not even drawn from this side of the room. The descent of the stairs looked particularly rushed, as the creator's pencil strokes grew increasingly long, shortening this stairway to only 8 steps. A curious detail in Roy's decision to sleep in the tree is that the house is now drawn just beside the tree, indicating that he is in this house's yard, a fact that was not indicated in the original book, and in fact may have not even been so. The final page is nearly identical, except that "the end" is written much more modestly at the bottom of the page, rather than in its own massive space. An immediate curiosity setting apart this third version of the story is that Roy is now drawn with a face. This narrows many of the possible interpretations throughout the story, notably on this first page that he was shot head-on by the Shrink-Ray, and we can assume it did not catch him much by surprise. I would like to reiterate that whatever transpires within these alternate versions should not reflect one's perfectly valid interpretations of the original work. The red exit sign occurs again here, but curiously, the doorknobs are once again drawn near the outside of the doors. In the mushroom scene, we once again see a narrowing of interpretations of the visuals, as it is made clear that Roy is traversing the mushroom caps from right to left. Curiously, the mushrooms in this version feature the exact same coloration as the original, which led me to believe that it was created with the original handy as a reference point.
The first alternate version was most likely made when I did not have access to the original. Like I said, I would lend them out to people, and I likely made this very rushed alternative when I had lost track of that first book. The other alternative, I'm pretty sure I made with the first iteration close at hand, in an effort to revise the original, maybe clarify the illustrations for less observant or imaginative readers.
If there was any doubt that this copy was intended as an outright revision or recreation of the original, I think the next page solidifies the fact that this intention was so. The mistake page was recreated here. The exact same multicolored splotch was retained on the back of page 3, so that there is no change to the page structure. However, in the encounter with the giant, the person's clothes were changed so that the pants are blue instead of purple, perhaps an effort to make them more realistic, resembling blue jeans. The seemingly refined nature of this addition begins to crumble within the next 2 pages. I thought at first that the next page outright omitted the giant stepping over Roy, but a close examination indicates that this character's presence was almost entirely obscured by the binding, caught between the staples. The page of Roy discovering the house appears outright unfinished. The beginnings of flowers were drawn here, but the tops were never filled in, appearing merely as leafy stems. The next 2 pages are nearly identical, to the point that I question whether they might be traced. Some proportions appear slightly adjusted in the wow scene. In the illustration of Roy descending the stairs, the stairway no longer has its enormous, surreal appearance, and Roy himself appears larger. This may be an intentional change of the story to indicate Roy slowly returning to his normal size, but in my eyes this eliminates a key element of the original story's suspense. Again we see Roy's declaration of sleeping in the tree, and curiously this is followed by a new page which explicitly illustrates him sleeping in the tree. He wakes up in much the same manner as the original, and the ending is declared in much the same way, except for one fatal flaw: the page was stapled on backwards and upside down. As you can see, at least from our read-through of the original volume, a wealth of story material awaits us. The only hint I will give you for now regarding Part 2 is that it takes the story to all new heights. To be continued. Production of this video was made possible by the following supporters. Particular thanks are due to donators Kate Yen and Liquid Infirmity. Thank you for watching.